The importance of Nicholas of Cusa for the history of logic is that he reinvents the field of theology from a Neo-Pythagorean perspective, in which there are unfolding dimensions across different planes of reality that structure the order of being and that situate the way in which we can make arguments dialectically and which we can frame the ground of being proportionately in analogy. So although these terms aren't explicitly framed by Nicholas of Cusa, albeit presenting a speculative reconstruction of how we can interpret them in continuity, on the one hand, with dialectic since Plato, and on the other hand, with the analogy of being since Aristotle and the Neoplatonists. Nicholas of Cusa stands as a pivotal figure both in pre-modern thought, as someone who comes before modern philosophy, while at the same time drawing from the wealth of Neo-Pythagorean and early medieval speculation in a way that seems to leap over the scholastic era and yet also gesture to the modern. But in as far as he occupies this pivotal caesura between the ancient and the modern, he also gestures even beyond the collapse of modern philosophy that we might observe in the reduction of the hierarchical forms of analogy to a univocal plane of being that ultimately evacuates being into nothingness. And in this way, he stands as a marked contrast to figures like Gilles Deleuze that haunt the modern era. In his reply to John Wenck, he writes, "Deliver us, O Lord, from the logicians, for a superabundance of logic is injurious rather than beneficial to sacred theology." The danger that he detects here is not only that logic can be sophistically weaponized to make the weaker argument seem the stronger, but that a secular form of logic can thereby inframe the art of reason under a false instrument that stands opposed in its incompleteness to the pacific concordance that is sought by the harmony of reason and revelation, which is called sacra doctrina, or sacred doctrine. His debate with the Aristotelian scholastics marks a salient fissure in late medieval and early modern solidifications of this simulated constitution of secular logic that haunts the modern era since the Thesis Universalis of René Descartes, in which the higher metaphysical ground of logic in the divine logos, coming from Philo and Origin of Alexandria, appears to be suspended, and the form of logic is simulated in what appears increasingly today as an abstract mnemonic computer of deductive consequences without any higher metaphysical ground or any guiding religious purpose. For the purpose, however, of recovering what we can call a potential history of contradictory theology, it raises what could perhaps be regarded as the first robustly theological critique since the time of Proclus and Pseudo-Dionysius and later of Eriugena of the supposed ultimacy of the law of non-contradiction that comes down from Aristotle's Book 4 of the Metaphysics. Since Aristotle and the Stoics, the sacred speech of God in theology has been increasingly simulated in the arguments of formal logic and regimented under the law of non-contradiction, which, as you well know, prohibits the conjunction of two absolutely opposed and thereby contradictory judgments. However, as early as the Council of Chalcedon, the formula of Christology that Christ is the hypostatic union of two natures in one person appears thereby to express an absolute contradiction of God becoming man in Christ, that is unlimited, immutable, and mutable simultaneously. That is, two natures in one person. This has been called by Richard Cross the fundamental problem of Christology, which appears as soon as the contrary attributes of two natures are expressed in the absolutely singular coincidence of one person of Christ. The Church Fathers were genuinely inclined to regard contradictions of Christian theology as no more than apparent contradictions, which could in principle be resolved by further dialectical analysis of the implication of their words and arguments. That is, they didn't regard these contradictions as ultimate or insurpassable. It is precisely this captivating glut of excess of multiple contradictory truths beyond the rule of the law of non-contradiction that has suggested for many a gamut of conflicting non-classical renditions of Nicholas of Cusa as a precursor to both Hegel's dialectics and Søren Kierkegaard's paradoxes. His coincidence of opposites, or coincidentia oppositorum, has been recognized by John Milbank as a forerunner of both a theology of paradox, in which the medieval scholastic analogy of being transgresses the law of non-contradiction, and by Graham Priest as what J.C. Beall has described as a dialetheist Christology, in which the divided human nature of Christ represents a true contradiction. So in the recent book, The Contradictory Christ, J.C. Beall advocates a contradictory Christian theology in which contradictions are neither trivializing nor resolvable, but simply a basic attribute of Christ. Following Richard Cross, he presents the so-called fundamental problem of Christology, where Christ is both God and man, unlimited and limited, and immutable and mutable. In contrast to Nouvelle Theologie and to Radical Orthodoxy and the recent Neo-Chalcedonian Hegelians from Boston College, J.C. Beall charts a new path for a contradictory Christology, which holds this contradiction to obtain not simply epistemologically in the arguments of human knowledge, but more ontologically in the very, as he says, being or nature of Christ himself. We can hear in Cusa an older and richer mingling of these themes, not only of dialetheism, but also arguably of dialectic and analogy. I will seek to recover from among the writings of Nicholas of Cusa, in particular Unlearned Ignorance, a reconstruction of medieval Christology in which the law of non-contradiction authorized an operation of this law that operates in and beyond the finite lines of discursive reason or ratio as a simulated product of a higher dialectic of the coincidence of opposites that ultimately shows us something of this analogical unfolding across dimensional planes and points forward to a counter-Deleuzian ontology of angelic depths. The question of the law of non-contradiction, of classical logic, and indeed of reason itself, hangs like a cloud of uncertainty above even the most naive readings of unlearned ignorance. For if contradictions cannot be held to be true by finite human discursive reason, but can in some higher sense be upheld as true by the speculative insight or intellectus of the divine intellect, then it seems Nicholas of Cusa should endorse a theological suspension of the ultimacy of the law of non-contradiction. The coincidence of opposites seems to suggest, in some higher divine sense, that contradictory judgments somehow coincide and are known by God as true. Such a suspension of this principle of logic has been the target of the Aristotelian scholastic John Wenck. He wrote in his polemic of how, for Cusa, quote, human intelligence elevates itself into that simplicity where contradictories coincide. However, he argues that such teaching of this coincidentia oppositorum, quote, destroys the fundamental principles of all knowledge, that is, the principle of non-contradiction. For as Aristotle had argued in Metaphysics 4, quote, it is impossible both to be and not to be the same thing, end quote, in one and the same way. In a striking anticipation of the theological agenda of J.C. Beall's Contradictory Christology, Wenck further argues that Cusa's suspension of the law of non-contradiction ultimately undermines classical Christian Christology. For in denying the prohibition of a contradiction between distinct judgment, he argues, quote, it destroys the individuality of Christ's humanity, calls this humanity God not on the basis of the hypostatic union, but on the basis of a very abstract understanding, end quote, and in a proto-Feuerbachian style, quote, assumes that the being of Christ is the being of each man. He accuses him of not only reducing, as it were, God to merely an abstract understanding of the one, but ultimately collapsing it into the one of the world and ultimately the one of our own self-projection. In response to Wenck, Cusa recalls how in Unlearned Ignorance he had formerly argued that, quote, God is not this thing and not any other thing, but is all things and not any of all things, end quote. For following Pseudo-Dionysius, but more ultimately Proclus, he argues that Wenck, quote, cannot grasp that, for the speculative intellect rather than for discursive reason, quote, the infinite is the most adequate measure of finite things, even though the finite is altogether disproportionate to the infinite, end quote, as the infinite line approaches the infinite circle that it coincides with and is consummated as the absolute maximum. Cusa attributes this absolute or maximum, maximalitas, to God, who among his transcendental attributes is oneness, goodness, and existence. Since he argues, quote, the maximum is the absolute one as such, quote, all things are in the maximum, end quote, and, quote, nothing is opposed to it, then there can be no opposition between the maximum and the minimum, end quote, as the minimum coincides in and with the maximum as the lowest coincides in and with the highest, and all the transcendental terms are joined together in an absolute coincidence of opposites. He says elsewhere that God is beyond the coincidence of opposites, but alternatively he suggests that human knowledge of God approaches by this hyperbolic coincidence of opposites or contradictory judgments. The maximum is, from the beginning to the end, paradoxically both absolutely complex and absolutely simple. In its transcendence of all relational opposites, the polar opposites, such as the minimum, are not particularly opposed to, but rather contained in it and identified as the maximum. Yet in spite of this hyperbolic excess of this principle, quote, beyond all rational inferences, end quote, Cusa nonetheless affirms that we can, quote, see incomprehensibly, quote, that absolute maximality that is infinite, that is, as the infinite is traced in and appears in through the finite. And it's this speculative insight that allows for him to progressively ascend to greater and greater knowledge of God in spite of the ostensible incomprehensibility of God or the maximum beyond finite discursive reason. In the descent of virtually quantified and proportionate harmonies, Cusa also authorizes what we can characterize following Pseudo-Dionysius as a hyperbolic grammar, that is, of the analogy of being. Now, the term analogy of being was introduced into medieval philosophy in the late 12th and early 13th century, drawing from commentaries of the Arabic philosophers on Aristotle. It was subsequently adopted by Bonaventure and Thomas Aquinas, and it doesn't feature explicitly in Nicholas of Cusa. Nonetheless, we can find precedents for and arguably the basic form of analogy already present in Plato and Aristotle and the Neoplatonists, and specifically in Pseudo-Dionysius. He uses the term harmonia to describe proportionate relations of the levels of being. And it's for that reason, paraphrasing Pseudo-Dionysius, that Nicholas of Cusa very much recapitulates this theme of the analogy of being, even though he doesn't explicitly speak of it. Accidents are, he writes, quote, more excellent in proportion to their participation in substance, and, quote, the more they participate in a more excellent substance of the ideas ultimately of God, quote, the still more excellent they are, end quote. For the accidents are, quote, more excellent in proportion to their participation in the substance of this analogical proportioning of the levels of being. Although the participatory ground of essential proportions and analogy involves an ostensible paradox of participation, it also points to God beyond all relational oppositions of contradiction. And this absolute precedence of God beyond relational opposition does not ipso facto imply that all subjects of judgment are equally beyond all relational opposition, or that God in creating and entering into the world does not show under the plane of consistency how subjects up to and including God can be known by overcoming absolute oppositions that emerge in and among the relations of this and other subjects. So although God transcends being, he also creates the ground in which there can be consistent judgments of the being of the created world. Cusa recalls the precedents of the Christian doctrine of the Trinity as far back as Pythagoras. Like the Chartrian Platonists that preceded him, Cusa's central problem may be how to reconcile a Pythagorean hyperbolic arithmology of 1 over many that converges upon or seeks to avoid the monarchy and unity of the one, even as it allows for a canonic release of Christ into a triadic co-equality of 3 hypostases in one divine essence. Specifically, how can you reconcile the convergence of the many in and by the one with a Christian kenosis of the incarnate Christ within the world, as well as the co-equality of the divine persons of the Trinity? How can you reconcile hynodology with Trinitarian theology? Nicholas of Cusa extends this Trinitarian co-equality of the equalization of the different, or of the unequal, from paternal oneness through the filial equalization of difference in and for spiritual reunion to what he calls the oneness of understanding, that is, to the discursive reason of arguments in dialectic. For Cusa argues, quote, without these 3 mutual relations of oneness, equalization of difference, and the reunion that coincides as opposites, the reader, quote, does not attain to the trinity of this oneness, and consequently, quote, does not rightly conceive of oneness at all. That is, in order to conceive of oneness, we have to conceive of multiplicity that is reunited as one, rather than simply one itself. And in this regard, he's very similar to the chapter on the one and the many in Hegel's doctrine of being in the Logic, where you cannot conceive the one as abstractly opposed to the many, or vice versa. Cusa leaves behind the monarchian one of the Neo-Pythagoreans and any subordinate schema of classical Neoplatonism, and yet nevertheless retains, proceeding from this hyperbolic center of absolute and simple abstraction, the divine processions that create and sustain the finite and figural processions from oneness through the equalization of difference in and for the reunion of all things that converge as a coincidence of opposites. He illustrates a Trinitarian geometry in his description of what he calls the super blessed Trinity. And there's an interesting parallel to a fragment of Hegel's from his Jena period in 1804 called the Divine Triangle, which sadly was lost, I think, in the Second World War, but is also a kind of Neo-Pythagorean speculation on the Trinity, which Cusa describes as an infinite triangle. So we have an idea that there's infinite triads coinciding in the Trinity itself. Since following Pseudo-Dionysius, these triadic processions of the Trinity unfold in and through angelic hierarchy, this radical impartation of Trinitarian processions in the elements of mathematics reciprocally elevates the hyper-arithmological and hyper-geometrical to the highest ground of the divine essence, such that, in a way that appears more radical than euryogena, arithmetic, and geometry are other elements radically Trinitarian. The paradox of what he calls the infinite triangle, in which there are 3 and both infinite sides, can be explained as the finite geometrical figure of the, quote, triangle consisting of 3 equal right angles is analyzed through the unfolding of the dimensions, that is, from 1 through the line through the polygon to the polyhedron, in and for the hyperbolic ground of transcendental oneness. And this circuit of unfolding dimensions can be reciprocally circulated in and from its source, that is, in a Trinitarian procession of paternal oneness through filial equalization of difference in and for the spiritual reunion of these coincidences of opposites, where at the highest ground of the divine essence, each of the divine persons is also infinite, and an infinity of infinity, as Origen and Gregory of Nyssa upheld, infinitely many-sided in a hypergeometrical figuration, such that this infinite triangle is itself the origin of every figure of a triangle. So in contrast to Hegel, Nicholas of Cusa is often read to have suspended paradoxes without a dialectical resolution of contraries, very much like Soren Kierkegaard or his successors. Yet in De Doctra Ignorantia 120, he describes how dialectical resolution of the coincidence of opposites is achieved by subsuming the infinite minimum under the infinite maximum, where both coincide in their mutual infinity. He argues that, quote, the Father is prior in such a way that the Son is not posterior, because as God is infinite, the posteriority of the Son coincides with the Father, so that the priority of the Son to the Spirit. Since further, quote, the Father is the first person without priority, and in such a way that the Son is not posterior, and with the Son and the Holy Spirit, the relational opposition of priority and posteriority among all the divine persons is eternally and continuously recycled. This recycling of contradictions is the key to Cusa's dialectic, in which the processions of paternal oneness through the equalization of difference in and for the reunion of coincidence of opposites extends from the divine persons in and through all concepts of created realities. Quote, all theology is circular, end quote, for Nicholas of Cusa, because it is, quote, based upon an infinite circle, quote, in which the end coincides in the eternal beginning, like the Oribus strip, and all dialectical circles recycle in and from what he calls the infinite middle, or the absolute middle, from which unfolds these dimensional planes of the essential proportions of analogies in all substance. We can recollect Nicholas of Cusa today as devising, through his reappropriation of Neo-Pythagorean speculation mediated through the early medievals, a standpoint of theological critique against an increasingly secular logic that was initiated by controversies emerging from the introduction of Aristotelian logic and the weaponization of Aristotelian logic against the synthesis of Augustine and the fathers in the early scholastics. And also the assumption, following René Descartes and Leibniz, that there could be a universal learning or thesis universalis that can provide a kind of timeless ocular gaze to master the pure forms of calculative reason by which, as it were, the whole of reality can be computed not only abstractly in our minds, but increasingly today in digital computers. He provides us with a way of rethinking all of this, not only as it proceeds in and from a hyperbolic ground that unfolds across dimensional planes through analogical relations that ground the proportions and hierarchy of being, but also in a way that allows for it to be not only a depth, but also an elevation of the hierarchy of being to escape from a flattening of ontology whereby all of these participatory relations that allow us to have cognitive access to the divine are continuously collapsed and the meaning and richness of being is evacuated into nothing. This provides us not only with a way of rehabilitating both classical dialectic from Plato to Hegel, but also the analogy of being in medieval scholasticism framed within Pythagorean terms that we can introduce at odds with and as a standpoint of critique against both those who would, as it were, flatten being into univocity on the one hand, or would attempt to simulate what can be known of reality entirely under a pneumatic or mechanical or cybernetic calculator. The movement in dialetheism, although it begins with a variety of Hegelianism as a critique of the foundations of formal logic, tends towards this kind of a thesis flattening of the calculative reason, by which it hopes to master not only the impasse that occurs when we encounter contradiction, but also the way by which we can possibly resolve it without allowing for either a speculative flight of reason or a leaping to faith or anything like the ecstasies of trinitarian ontology that we find so admirably witnessed in Nicholas of Cusa.